So AI undoubtedly has a place, but we need to be sure of what that place is and how to best utilize it so that it doesn't steal our essential humanity. After all, if you think about it, AI only exists as an accumulation of and a repository for human creativity, along with tons of imperfect information. So it's subject to bias, data bias, manipulation, sycophancy. I mean, it's early days yet, it'll hopefully improve, but there are multiple concerns about it. But ultimately, AI can't exist without human creativity. And you need to be creative to truly master it anyway. And in fact, the need for creativity is going to increase as AI takes hold, because you basically, in a world where everything that is known can be accessed, then obviously we've got to be very creative about how we use that information, how we actually operate in our world, in our business, and so on. And so basically, human creativity, to my mind, is the more powerful thing. All right. Here's an interesting thought. The guy who invented the wheel was an idiot. Can anybody relate to that? Understand what I'm talking about here? This is
No.
this is if you think about it, when the guy invented the wheel, um, this thing didn't help him outrun a saber-toothed tiger. It was nothing he could cook. It was nothing he could eat, and so on and so forth. And this is one of the things about creativity, that anybody who's creative, as soon as you have one single creative thought, you're in a minority of one. So you have a job to do when you're creative. You have to basically introduce it, give it context, and all sorts of things like this, because most people really, while they think they'd like to be creative, and apparently only 40% of people think they are creative, when in fact they are creative, we actually prefer to sit back into processes, and just learn something once and then go with it, and not really have to sort of bother with the disruption of creativity. This actually was said by a comedian, and I thought this was rather nice. There was a guy playing on the Washington Underground, playing violin for quite a while, as you see. This is all speeded up. And nobody was taking much notice. I think there were one or two women there who took a bit of notice, and there was some kid who liked the music. But what they didn't know was that this guy was Joshua Bell, who was one of the best violinists in the world. And he was playing a $3.5 million violin. And he was playing exactly the same music that he'd played the night before to standing ovations in a major concert hall. So what does this tell us? It tells us, when there's no context for the creativity, for we can't necessarily understand it. We can't engage with it. It's kind of foreign to our brain. And also, of course, we're so occupied, all these people going to their jobs and all this kind of stuff, that it becomes something that you can easily overlook. This is interesting. This was a real house in Oxford, and this guy constructed this shark and had it sort of poking through the roof. And now, as a neighbour, what would you think? Right? um, and it was really interesting because in England, you have to have planning permission if you increase the living area of a house. So he didn't need planning permission. He just needed to pass the building regulations. And a very creative idea. All the neighbors were up in arms until it became so famous that people started coming to look at this place. And I went and saw it. It was in Oxford, in England. And their property prices started going up because of this shark in the roof. And eventually, this guy sold this house at a huge profit and moved to a much more select area, where he actually put a Sherman tank in the front garden. But it just shows that, how we react to creativity can also change over time. It can surprise us. It can create opportunities and things that we'd never have thought of if we'd just been doing what one normally does in life. And of course, in art as well, creativity is obviously, a place for art, and art is the place where most creativity happens. Well, a lot of creativity happens. This was a piece of art based on what became a very famous photograph of this woman called Myra Hindley, who was known as the Moors murderer, because she murdered many young children. It's a bit difficult to see on this, but this entire painting was made up of children's handprints. So this caused a big stir at the time. It was a very creative idea, but it also gave pause to reflect and think about our society, about children, about murder, and so on and so forth. It was at a time when people hadn't seen this kind of thing before. They weren't used to being shocked by art, it had a lot of impact. And then art can shock as well. It can be incredibly distasteful. It can be surprising. Simple juxtapositions, things seen in a slightly different way, can make you feel quite disturbed. Like this, for instance, when you turn this eye round 90 degrees and use it as part of a poster for a festival erotic cinema in Barcelona, something else happens. I mean, at this point, people tend to go very quiet in my presentation and think, what the heck's he going on? What's happening here? Terrible bad taste, or whatever, but it makes the point very clearly that art can shock and surprise. And, basically we do the work, that's just somebody's eye, but we do all the work to actually interpret what's going on here. So very interesting from that point of view. And also, we resist creativity like hell. I met this woman in this wheelchair some years ago in Vancouver. And it was basically an interesting situation, because it talked to me about the fact that we need validation by others to feel okay about creative things. And also it talked very much to the programming that we receive that actually prevents us from accepting creative ideas. Now, this woman had what's called ankylosing spondylitis, which is a very severe form of arthritis. And it put her in this wheelchair, as far as she was concerned, for the rest of her life. And I met this woman and I said to her, there is a cure for this. And I could not break through that programming, she could not accept it. It was almost as if she was more comfortable to think that she would spend her life in a wheelchair rather than look at something creative. Because I can tell you, most of the medical profession will tell you that there is no cure for arthritis. I mean, I can tell you I've had arthritis and I've got rid of it. She had terrible arthritis. But the interesting thing about this one was that I have a very good friend, Adam, who had exactly the same problem. This was when he had it, ankylosing spondylitis. He couldn't walk. He had to create a little trolley to get himself around, and that was the only way he could move. But then he met this guy, Frank Luddy, who sadly is no longer with us. But he had developed a very, very radical, very original way to treat the body with metabolic therapy. And he cured Adam. He put him on a very strict diet, and Adam is now like this. He hasn't had arthritis for 30 years. And he can walk a heck of a lot further than I can. But Frank Luddy was vilified by the profession, by the medical profession. And the woman who had that disease would rather stick with it, stick with what the medical profession told her, rather than chance going to see this guy who had very successfully cured my friend. So it just, and Adam wrote a book on it. I published the book for him, and it gives the entire system of how to get rid of this absolutely dreadful, debilitating disease. But I can tell you, when I went to the hospital and asked what I could do about my arthritis, I was advised to get leg braces and things like this. Thankfully, I took Frank Luddy's advice, and it got rid of it. So we're very tied down by conventions and thinking that we know what is best. And creativity can be a bit of a nuisance in that it disrupts our comfortable feeling about the way the world is. So this Bertrand Russell quote speaks to this quite well. The fundamental course in the world today is that the stupid are cocksure while the intelligent are full of doubt. So the cocksure, if you think about it, are following narratives and collective thinking, and they live in the past because it's all stuff received, and that's what's made them so confident and sure about themselves. The intelligent question, they search, they test, they disrupt, they live in the present. And it's the intelligent who do that, who create and enable the future. It's not the people who are sure of themselves. And talking of conventions, when I did this for presentation first time several years ago, it was quite funny because at that time, if you were, this is a very trivial example of a convention, by the way. At that time, if you were a successful person, the way you showed it as a man was to wear a pink shirt, pink tie, and a dark suit. I mean, ludicrous when you think about it. I mean, it's just an example of so many conventions that we respect and live by and take on as we go, simply because that's what people say you should do. I mean, unfortunately, it didn't work. It didn't work for this guy particularly, who had to swap his pink shirt, pink tie, dark suit for an orange suit and a black hat and a comfortable chair when he was electrocuted to death because he was Karadzic, the Serbian warlord. So, conventions don't work. So anyway, what is interesting again is that the people you remember don't follow any conventions. It's those who celebrate their individuality. There are no pink shirts here, as you can see, and these are all people that we remember because they didn't follow conventions. They all have a strong sense of self. They're independent, creative minds. I often talk about, people often talk about, getting out of their comfort zone. Well, what I see it as is that we actually tend to be living in our coping zone, and we don't find our comfort zone unless we do this kind of exploration. We're programmed to be ourselves at a deeper level if we want to go there, or we're determined to find ourselves. And it makes you wonder, why aren't we all like these people? And we all know who they are, apart from the guy in the middle at the bottom, and I'll explain him in a minute. They're not superhuman. I mean, I met Richard Branson. He was just an ordinary guy, but he'd figured a few things out by thinking for himself, But the problem with most of us is that stuff happens along the way. We get conditioning, we get our belief systems set up for us. They're not ours, they're other people's, but we take them on and they become part of our identity. The family, peers, the education is the worst, obviously. And we lose a lot of ourselves. I don't know, I'm sure a lot of you can relate to this, but just to explain, the guy in the middle at the bottom is Stanislav Burzynski, who basically successfully found cures for cancer. Now, it's interesting how, he's not the only one, by the way. There are plenty of people who found cures for cancer. He demonstrated his cures on many patients. But of course, now there's a whole industry around cancer research and things. I mean, in Vancouver, where we used to live, there was a tower block devoted to cancer research. Lots of people had lots of jobs and so on and so forth. So you just wonder sometimes if people actually want to find a cure for cancer. But so he was very creative. He did it. Again, got struck off. All the usual things, basically to keep people in line rather than celebrate and say, fantastic, you've got a cure for cancer. Wonderful, let's have it. You know, so that's the way I'm afraid it is. And what is true is we don't actually live our life very much. I mean, this is what Seneca wrote in AD 49. We haven't changed much since then, which is quite incredible when you think about it. It's a small part of life that we live. And it's when you think of the old 80-20 rule, um, about the research has been done that says that 80% of our productive work is done in 20% of the time, which is true if you think about it. You know, you're going making coffee, you're thinking about things, you know, you're not actually working for most of the time. Add to that the fact that at least 80% of our brain is subconscious. A huge amount of our brain is subconscious. Only 20% at most is conscious. So if you do the maths on this, if we're doing 80% of our work in 20% of the time, and 20% of us is conscious and 80% is subconscious, 20% of 20% is 4%. So effectively, you could say that we're 90%, 96% switched off from ourselves. So you think about that. I mean, there's a huge potential there. You know, that we're leading a life of constraint, governed by ideas of others, believing we're making our own choices. And it's very hard to see. It's very hard to see. So where is your elephant? Where is your other 96%? It's hidden outside your logical, conscious realm. That's where it is. Okay? Let's have a look at how the brain works. I mean, you probably all know this. We've got the reptilian brain, the amygdala, fight and flight. First reaction is it going to kill me? Is it dangerous? That's what kicks in first. Then we got the limbic, which comes in, which is about feeling and caring and nurturing and desire to communicate, language, sharing, those kind of things. So that's the next thing after the fear, after the amygdala, and the reptilian, is the limbic comes in. It's about feeling. And then after that, the good old cortex comes in, which rationalizes everything, very practical, very logical, a bit of a sort of pedestrian part of our brain compared to the limbic. And so ultimately, we're in a situation where we tend to rely on the cortex more than the limbic. We think, oh, yes, something feels nice, but let's work it out. Let's see if it really is what we should be doing, what we should be thinking, all this kind of stuff. But as Einstein said, logic, which is the cortex, will get you from A to B. Imagination will take you everywhere else. And that's an important thing that we tend to overlook. Because imagination is a unique human ability, no other animal has it, to envisage something that previously didn't exist. Creativity is applied imagination because of creativity, we have infinite capacity. I mean, it's amazing what mankind has done, since he's been around, And then applied creativity is innovation. In other words, putting that creativity to good use, and on a personal level, we may try to use that capacity, but we're hampered very often by lack of self-worth, fear, lack of self-awareness, and so on and so forth. And on a planetary level, we usually mess it up every time. So What I want to do now is explain why that is. So let's look deeper into how we operate as human beings. And this is a system that a guy I got to know who lives in New York, he's a Frenchman, lives in New York, called Francis Scholl. Very nice man. And this applies to a lot of, I'm going to be talking about a lot of big companies, but it applies to small companies, it applies personally and in every sense. So don't think this is just about big companies, but it's very illustrative of some very important points about how we operate as human beings. So what he did was he created a thing called the intuitive compass. And the so what he's saying is on one axis, what we do something for a reason, or we do it out of intuition. We're doing something just because it's a little light bulb comes on in our head, or we're doing something because we believe there's a good reason to do it. Simple. And we're doing things either just to play, to have fun, or for no reason at all, or we're doing it to get a result. So we've got those two axes. And then what he did was he split this up into the 4 quadrants: northwest, northeast, southwest, southeast. He worked out lots of questions for corporate, for personal, and so on and so forth, that would basically tell you how strong you are in each of these quadrants. And I'll explain the quadrants in a minute. So the strength goes from 1 to 5, 1 at the middle, 5 to the outside. 1 is very weak, 5 is very strong. And when it was fun, because when he asked the questions, you don't necessarily know which quadrant it is relevant to, but then you find out, and so you can then work out what your strengths and weaknesses are in the following ways. So what we got, if you think of it, between play and reason, you've got perspectives and options, reflection, strategy, things like that. So you're playing with an idea and it's related to some sort of reason. Maybe you haven't actually even defined that reason yet, but you're looking at things intuitively. On the top right at the northeast, you've got what's between reason and results. Now, if you think about that, that's management. It's all analytical, it's methodical, it's organized, it's your admin. So you're doing things for a reason to get a particular result. At the bottom right, you've got performance, which is intuition and results. You've got salesmen. They're thinking, oh yeah, I can figure this out. I can get this result by using this idea. It's about commitment and clarity, determination, that kind of thing. And then at the bottom left-hand corner, you have imagination. That's your gut feelings between play and intuition. Makes sense, doesn't it? So creativity sits there. And that's obviously where growth is, because without creativity, you can't have growth. I've basically suggested a few extreme cases, like this one, that's very, very strong on strategy, very strong on management, very weak on creativity, very weak on sales. And obviously, this is an extreme example. I mean, we all operate in different forms of this. I know that, for instance, I'm strong. I'm a sort of 5 in the southwest. I'm probably a 4 in the northwest, a 3 in the northeast, and possibly a 2 even in the southeast. So that shows me the weaknesses in the way I operate. But these are just idealized examples. Now, I don't know if you can sort of imagine an organization or a company that fits this kind of pattern. That's very weak, very strong on strategy, very strong on management, very weak on creativity, very weak on sales. I mean, put the words in the chat if you think of anything. But I'll give you the first one just so that you get the idea. I've suggested here the accounting, certainly. I've suggested here the the United Nations. I worked at the United Nations, all about strategy, all about management, about creating really long, boring reports that sit on shelves. And the United Nations has not United Nations. They're not creative. The people on the ground are the creative ones, the NGOs and things. The United Nations themselves are basically also up their asses, that they can't think of a creative idea. And they're not particularly good at selling their ideas to people either. So, they're fairly ineffective. How about this one? A lot of management, a lot of sales, very little strategy, very little creativity. Any thoughts? What kind of company could that be? And bear in mind, of course, what we're talking about here with these extremes is basically potential for failure, yeah, in some aspect or other. So what I've put down here, I don't know, are you writing something for Alfredo? I don't know, but yeah, okay, you're just writing it down. So what I've suggested here is Blockbuster, Borders, Best Buy. Blockbuster, we all knew 10 years ago as the place where you'd go and get your videos for your VHS. Huge, all over the place. But they didn't see Netflix coming. Apparently, they could have bought Netflix for 50 million very easily, but they continued with they had a lot of property they were dealing with, and obviously they were into sales of videos and things. And that's where they focused their minds. They lost track of their strategies and certainly weren't being creative because they were just doing the same thing all the time. And so effectively what was happening was the board of directors, who should be in the northwest, had moved to the northeast and the southeast. So they were just putting pressure on people to sell and looking at the management of the place. The same was happening with Best Buy at the time. They managed to recover though. Borders, on the other hand, was a big chain of bookshops that felt invincible. They thought they were very clever. They were doing great stuff. But again, they had the same problem. But one of their problems was that they saw ebooks coming along and they gave Amazon that business. I mean, what a disaster, strategically a complete nonsense. So, and that Amazon completely wiped them out. So, it's interesting how, because they were weak on one side, they basically risked their very survival.
You have the examples like Kodak.
I'll come to that one later, Alfredo. Thank you very much.
And the minivan, Lee Iacocca brought the idea of the minivans to Ford, and they rejected it when he became CEO of General Motors. He developed the minivan, and it was a huge success.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll come to Kodak later, though. Thanks for that one. Any thoughts on this one? High on strategy and creativity, hopeless on management and sales. Well, let me introduce you to a guy called Jack Parsons. You probably hadn't heard of him, but he was a renowned and charismatic scientist, chemist, and pioneer. He was also an occultist, a bohemian, who went deep into the abyss of his own psyche. He talked to entities, used exotic symbols, and practiced orgies. He died in an explosion during one of his rocket propulsion experiments caused by mixing fulminate of mercury in a coffee can. So very creative, very strategic in the sense that he was thinking up ideas that could have had legs, but he didn't have the rest of the business savvy, and he couldn't sell his ideas. And ultimately, I mean, he made a lot of money doing all this stuff, but it never translated into anything of value. Last one. Any thoughts on this? Hopeless on strategy and management, very creative, into sales. Oh yeah, Nikola Tesla. Well, yeah, Nikola Tesla was another one. Yes, thank you, Jose. Yeah, in the last example. Yes, absolutely. What a brilliant man. I might change that for Mr. Nikola Tesla. Thank you. So this one, um, what I put here is it's a rock group called The Alarm that I had the dubious pleasure of doing a few album covers for way back in the day. I mean, they actually sold a lot of records in America, particularly. I mean, they couldn't manage their way out of a paper bag, so the whole thing went to pot. I mean, literally. So hopeless. So you can see how if you don't get this right, you are very, very you're risking failure. So what are we ideally looking for? Well, obviously it's this. It's to square the circle, to be strong in all those areas. And there are companies that we will, these are just a few examples of companies that we know who at least started off like that. I mean, for instance, Steve Jobs was an incredible visionary, and he wasn't really thinking about computers. He was thinking about thinking differently. I mean, he had that wonderful campaign he did of Think Different. Wasn't as Bill Gates was selling the capacity of computers, Steve Jobs was selling the vision of what computers could do for you. And obviously, we know Google and Virgin basically didn't accept the convention of high cost airfares, boring flights, almost dressing up to go abroad and things. And he introduced cheap flights. And in the early days, he was doing things like putting musicians on planes to keep people entertained and things like this. And so, he's being very creative, but he also had all the other sides to it as well. And what we're concentrating on here, obviously, is this corner. And this is one that we tend to forget as we go through our business day. But this is the bit, and I'm going to read a list here, so please excuse me. But it ensures that your organization is constantly dynamically evolving, very important these days. It keeps you sensitive to changes inside and out, flexible and alert, positive and inspired. It generates opportunities for cost savings, improvements in efficiency, fresh marketing ideas, and the discovery of new directions. It promotes creative leadership, which builds strong, inspired teams. It generates interest and active engagement within the organization and brand loyalty outside. It engages untapped potential in people, keeping them focused, motivated, and innovative. And it keeps your organization ahead of the game. So let's see how that works in terms of what kind of trap you can fall into if you get this wrong. So you need to know where you are on the S curve. But most companies, all companies pretty well, and coaches and everybody start off with a creative idea. They think, oh yes, great, the world needs this. I love it, and I'm going to do it. And having had the creative idea, they basically build the business, make improvements, maybe do an extra course or two, go to conventions, do all the right things, and basically the creativity gives way to process. So again, if you think about, the limbic and the cortex and the left and the right sides of the compass, basically the creative idea gets left behind and pushed into process. And it's necessary to have process, but if you haven't got that balance and you're not aware, you end up getting to the top and suddenly finding that you're irrelevant. Because this is a very dynamic situation that loads and loads of companies have come into and have not realized. And this is a very important thing for everybody. And this is something that changes all the time. Where are you on the S curve? Do you know even? And so what you need to do before you reach the top of this curve is you need to start a new one. You need to find new ideas. You need to be creative to avoid falling over the top of that And, this is what's called the innovation gap. And Alfredo, you mentioned just now Kodak. I worked with Kodak a long time ago, during their heyday. I lived near Hemel Hempstead, where they had the British headquarters. They were the king of film. They felt completely invincible. And when I worked with them, they just built the two huge warehouses up near the motorway. They were developing new films all the time. They had Kodachrome, which was acknowledged as being one of the best. And they got me actually to test a new film that was better than Kodachrome, would you believe? But it could be processed in a lab. You didn't have to send it off like you had to do with Kodachrome. And I went on one of my photographic trips, which we'll come to later. And I tested some of this film for them, and it was utterly brilliant. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. And I mean, I was doing sort of fashion and glamour stuff at the time, and you came back and you could see every single hair and pore, and it was just absolutely amazing quality. But at the same time, there were kind of murmurs in the headquarters at Kodak, and they were talking about a four-letter word beginning with F, which is Fuji. Because while Kodak were developing these incredibly accurate, wonderful films that were basically very, very true to life, Fuji was selling the dream. They were creating films that basically people were buying because the colors were oversaturated and warm, and it made all their holiday snaps look really lovely. So Kodak, by comparison, started to look very cold, and they lost the business. They lost it completely. They had to shut down because they weren't selling the dream. They were selling the practicality. Kodak did various other things as well at the same time. I don't know if you know, but they invented the digital camera, but they buried it to protect their film industry. So they also invented an alternative to Polaroid. But, so basically, by not maintaining their creative understanding and also not keeping their strategic side creative as well, the left-hand side of the compass, they basically risked everything and lost. And that can happen to anyone. So I read this quote the other day, which I feel is kind of interesting and a bit of a warning, actually, that said that thanks to algorithm-driven confirmation bias, many people have become polarized and happy with turning off creative, critical, and independent thinking, and are living in fear and compromise, in peer group bubbles of indoctrination, rather than getting uncomfortable enough to investigate all possibilities. And this is very interesting because, as you can see, creativity is very much about survival. So if you basically shut down that side of you, if you don't engage it actively and spend time on it and develop it and really love it, you are risking your entire business or whatever you're doing. And if you think about it on a planetary level as well, we face revolutionary challenges. We got, how many was it? 10 billion on the planet? I don't know. The world apparently at US rates of consumption can sustain 1.5 billion. I don't know who worked these numbers out, but that's what they say. At Rwanda's rate of consumption, it can sustain 17 billion. So we'd be okay if we were all Rwandan. Water. I mean, I've worked with a company on water a lot, and just last year they had a big conference at the United Nations about water, and basically 2.4 billion, or 1 in 4 people on the planet, lack safe drinking water. Yet we're pouring vast amounts into cooling computers for AI. You think of energy. We've got a global energy crisis that's driving poverty, yet AI is being pushed as the way ahead while consuming amounts of energy that could drive whole cities. And then, of course, you've got digital IDs, CBDCs, surveillance and control, et cetera, et cetera. We've got accelerating crises, and we have to think differently. The only way we can do that is through creativity. So, can you see the miracle in front of you, the miracle that you are? If not, maybe you need to slow things down a bit, because if we don't know how to be, how the heck can we know what to do? How conscious are you? How well do you know yourself? And how much of your doing is proactive and how much is reactive? And how much is doing because of the expectations of others? Just think about this. Conscious being enhances creativity. Unconscious doing kills it. So when we're creating, and we're doing one of these two things, we're either creating, and when we're creating, we are creating ourselves. We're creating our future, our power, and our unique individual fulfillment. On the other hand, when we're consuming, we are giving ourselves away to who or whatever is providing what we are consuming. And what we are consuming is never ultimately there for our benefit. Never ultimately. We're always doing one of those two things. So you make a choice, going back to the compass. You could look at it this way. The bottom left is about heart. The top right is about mind. And on the top right, we've got process, administration, management, delivery. And on the bottom left, we've got purpose, promise, mission, vision, values. And that line across that diagonal is one that's really hard to cross for a lot of people, because a lot of people get devoted to one side or the other. Like a financial person talks a completely different language to a marketing person. A manager can't really wrap his head around vision, particularly. You know, well, take the example, for instance, of Dragon's Den. You've got all the guys in the suits in the top right-hand corner, basically demanding that the people in the bottom right-hand corner justify themselves. And there's the people in the bottom right-hand corner, all the creative people thinking out wonderful ideas, who basically very often can't actually figure out the language that they need to use to convince the people on the other side of that line to give them the money that they need to make their ideas come to fruition. So ultimately, you know, if we're not complete, we're not balanced human beings in business and personally, we're out of harmony. You know, we need both sides of that line in harmony to be totally successful in our business, in our life, in our relationships, and so on and so forth. You know, we start out in life with a plan, and this is the plan. But what happened is more like that. And that's certainly the way it went for me. So here's me a few years ago. You know, when we're born, aren't I beautiful? You know, I just, what can I say? When we're born, you know, we're an amazing sponge, incredible learning capacity, and with no discernment, of course. So we just basically absorb everything. And between, I would say, 1 and 5 years, we probably learn more than we do in the rest of our lives. You know, we learn language, we learn so many things that we basically shove back into our subconscious and accept as reality. And a lot of course it is, you know, so how to walk is a subconscious process, but, you know, it's very handy. So the subconscious is building a huge store of knowledge there. And then this is me a few years later. Um, this is my first press call. This was for the Birmingham Post as Robin Hood, and they asked, and that was my first kiss with Maid Marian. I was Robin Hood. So you get to 7 years old, and as the Jews say, give me a child until he is 7, and I will give you the man. And by then, so much of our views on life, our programming has been set. You know, our place in society, our ideas about ourselves, what we think we're capable of, and so on and so forth. It's all there in our subconscious. And so we actually begin a shutting down process after that. See that kind of arrogant know-all smile as as you're going through grammar school. You know, you've been working on the conditioning for a few years. Your belief systems are firmly in place and reinforced by the world and life. So we think we know it all. You know, we're educated or programmed for compliance and a certain way of thinking. So our narrow perspective is achieved. We can't even see how the world of others works. When in that state, we're nicely set up for manipulation by others. We're disempowered with a huge part of ourselves missing. And so if we don't know who we are, how can we know what to do in life? But very often, and I'm sure you've experienced this, something inside you knows. It wants to get us back. You know, you get into situations and you feel uncomfortable because you know that they don't actually quite gel with you, or something. There's something in there. You know, there's a real part of you that's trying to make itself heard, and so we become dissatisfied and perhaps start searching. And that's, I guess, you know, when I was that age, that's when I started rebelling. You start rejecting what you've been told. Well, some of us do. But because so much of us is missing, while we're looking for that thing, because we've been programmed to believe in everything out there, we believe the answers are all out there. They're not in us. So we're ripe for exploitation by marketing, governments, relationships, whatever, you know. We're set up. And for me, I felt a huge need for connection. This was the school I went to, my first grammar school, which was built in 1640, I believe. So very traditional, very stiff, and very macho, you know, boys only school and all that kind of stuff. So there was a lack of connection, but there were codes that you lived by and rules that you understood to help you survive and all that kind of stuff. So I found it very important when adults or teachers really made a connection with me, or saw me for who I was, even if I couldn't, you know. But the education system that I went through actively suppressed creativity. You know, if you had an idea, an original idea, it had to be tested through the educational system. In other words, if that idea agreed with something that some famous person had said in the past, that they basically built the curriculum, you're okay. If it didn't, then you were wrong, right? So you have this suppression of creativity. And I gave up art, which I was very good at when I was young. I gave it up for engineering because my conditioning was that of never getting too rich, but never being poor. You know, I was clever enough to have a nice blue-collar job, management or something like that, but never to really excel. But all this time, there was part of me trying to break through, you know, and it had to break through in the end for me. Some people, it never does, and it's very sad. But I left school and went to university, dropped out of university because I was doing engineering there, and it just became impossible. Went into graphic design, marketing communications, and photography. And, you know, photography was fun. I mean, I did all sorts. This is Alison in Mauritius. Uh, she's wearing a rubber dress. It took a lot of talcum powder and 2 people to get her in and out of it because it was very hot in Mauritius, very humid. Um, but it was great fun for a time. It was absolutely wonderful. This is a fashion shoot in Andorra for an American clothing company. I did lots of calendars and things. Every guy I knew wanted to come and help me carry my bag. I did. I could tell you wonderful stories about the calendars and things for Volkswagen and people like that. Um, and I, it was fun. And this is Kate, one of the models I took with me, who I became her favorite photographer. And it was interesting, actually, after one of the trips, a very rich man I know basically uh, had his house decorated, spent tens of thousands of pounds on his house, and he wanted some photos for the rooms. And so I said, okay, hired Kate and a makeup artist and various things. And I said, we'll do these photos, do photos in each room of the house. And then we'll hang the photo in the room that it was taken in. And this was great. I mean, this was the bathroom, obviously. This was a 6 foot wide print, eventually, sepia print with all the autumn leaves hand colored that's basically hung over the bath. And it looked great. It was wonderful. But the problem was that he had these 2 dogs, and he wanted photos of them as well, which was a bit of a pain because they wouldn't sit still. They were just awful things. But so I said, okay, well, never mind. I'll do an oil painting of them. And this is about stepping into creativity and going beyond your coping zone, having trust, because I didn't know how to do an oil painting. I'd never done one in my life. And and I had no idea what I was doing, but I did this oil painting, and it's still hanging in his house to this day. And as a result, my then wife said, "Well, okay, you look as if you're pretty good at this. So why don't you start taking evening classes? Do some drawing and life drawing and all that kind of stuff." And I thought, okay, I did some evening classes, and I went to my local college where this crazy American woman went round the class on roller skates to see everybody's work and things. She liked what I was doing and invited me to another person's house for basically a bit more serious life drawing. So I went to this house, kept banging my head because this house was owned by a midget who had actually been cast for R2-D2 in Star Wars at one point. But there, when we were there, this rather flouncy, fancy woman was coming, German woman, and we got chatting, and she said, "Well, would you like to come round to my house? Because at the weekends we have tutors, and I've got a great kind of studio there, and we've got life drawing and all sorts of things." And I said, "Yeah, great, fantastic." So I remember the first time I went there, I drove to the address you gave me, through one electric gate, then another electric gate, and then there's this huge mansion. And I discovered her husband was this guy. You know who this is? Yeah, Stanley Kubrick, one of the greatest film directors of the last century. And so Christiana, his wife, basically, when he met her, he basically said, "Well, what do you want to do in life?" And she said, "I want to be an artist." And she was an artist. And so this enormous place had an entire building where, with all the best art materials in the world, all the processes, you've got etching, you've got screen printing, everything. It had a huge room upstairs in the mansion with 2 stages. On each was a model for you to draw. And it just went, I mean, it was just heaven for artists, and lots of really good, serious artists there. And it was fabulous. But basically, that taking that risk of not knowing basically led to the start of my art career, which is, by the time I got to that point, I was getting pretty fed up with the photography. And also, digital photography was coming in, and it was pretty clunky when it first came in. And this seemed a lot more interesting to me. I'm a sort of serial creative. I get bored very easily. This is about not letting the negative judgments of others override your intuition. So when I was little, about after my Robin Hood days, I used to have a wonderful teacher who loved my stories. Everything I wrote, she loved my stories, very creative stories. And she used to get me to read them out at the front of the class and all this kind of stuff. And then she left, and this woman turned up, Mrs. Bryan, her name was. And I went up to her, with one of my stories. And she basically said to me, "Oh, you never could write stories, could you?" And so that basically killed my story writing, killed my English for 50 years. So, that's how powerful, when you're younger, especially, a negative comment, an unguarded comment, an ignorant, stupid comment can be. And we all know that. I'm sure there are times in your lives when you've had these pivotal moments. But, it took me 50 years then to get around to writing my first novel, which I wrote in 3 months, 250,000 words. And I loved every minute of it. I found it came very easily, and the book got really good reviews. So, believing that we can't do something because of an event like that can be extremely damaging and completely irrelevant to you. And since then, I've written some more books and things as well, and I've got a couple more on the go. You don't normally associate washing machines with Olympic medals, I don't suppose. But this guy did. His name was Graham Obree. And he was a cyclist. He used to do velodrome events. And he was obsessed with finding, this is in the days when bicycles were basically just drop handlebars, normal bicycles, and they just, made them go as fast as they could. But he was obsessed with going faster and faster. So what he was doing was he was thinking, well, how can I make my bike go faster? And he looked at every single aspect of the bike in a creative way. And he thought, well, the bearings on the wheels, how can I make those go faster? What bearings go really fast? And he just thought of his washing machine on spin cycle. And so what he did was he adapted his washing machine bearings onto his bike to make it go faster. And he did loads of other things as well. It's very creative stuff. He developed this crouching position with his elbows right in, and this helmet to help him get more streamlined. He found there was a lot of wind resistance in spokes, normal spokes. So he built these flat spokes. And on this bike in particular, you can see 2 forks at the front. Why do you need 2 forks? He just had 1 fork at the front. So saved weight, made it more less wind resistant and so forth. And he started winning medals. And people initially laughed when they saw this strange bike and this guy in this strange position, but he was winning. And eventually he fell foul of some regulation. They stopped him doing it, but they eventually got through that. And he developed this thing which he called the Superman pose. And if you look at any velodrome events now, you'll see that they're all doing it the same way. So all of that came from a washing machine, which I thought was absolutely priceless. People tend to rush headlong into things that ultimately become huge problems. And of course, one of those is the cell phone, which I was also involved in the early days of cell phones. This is when cell phones looked like this in the 1990s. I started looking at cell phones in a critical way because that's what I do. I question everything. And while people were, getting sort of all obsessed about these things, I basically looked at the environment that they were moving into and what was happening with electromagnetic radiation. And we discovered that at the time, a lot of people were getting nasty cancers and things from these things, and were unable to work and things like that. Technology has changed a bit, but it's still dangerous. Everybody knew this was dangerous. The government knew, the National Radiological Protection Board that was supposed to protect the population knew, the military knew. We had a guy from Porton Down on our medical side who knew. They all knew that they were dangerous. WHO knew. They'd done a big convention in '74, I think, where they established that they cause cancer and so on. But it was all sort of being quietened down. But nevertheless, the phone industry was concerned. And I discovered that every single major phone manufacturer had put in a patent application for a device that would protect people from their own products, which was very interesting. And one of these had a huge report by the IEEE in America explaining exactly why their product was so dangerous. And so I used that report to create a product using B-2 stealth technology, the stuff they put on the wings of B-2 bombers, and other technologies to create a product that would protect people from these phones. Ironically, this material was also being used at the time inside the phone to protect components from each other, but not to protect people. There were no real tests for these things. The tests in England, the government tests, were based on hair dryers because they were only interested in the heating effects. And so it was very successful. And I eventually realized that I launched it at the Institute of Directors on Pall Mall. I had Carol Vorderman presenting it and all sorts of things, got on BBC, and made a big stir. But the industry had a very powerful PR operation going to flatten anything like this. While it worked, and I was complimented by someone in Vodafone for it, they basically said, we can't admit there's a problem. So the ultimate game, the creative game that I was playing here, was to capitalize on the concern that the industry had that people would find out they were dangerous by creating a standard, a licensed standard, which would include some of this material inside the phone, which reduced the emissions coming off them. And that standard would be licensed to a fraction of a cent per phone. And that would have basically allowed me to buy my own private island, I think. It didn't quite work because they actually PR'd their way out of this problem. And now we have this situation where they're still dangerous, and they're being used, they've got social problems, psychological problems, health problems, and of course now they're being used as the main vehicle of control of populations. So, while the creative impetus was there for protection, the commercial impetus overtook it. Last example that I'm going to show you is about currency trading. And I went to Vancouver, went to live in Vancouver, which is like the Wild West of finance. And somebody introduced me to currency trading, which I found was very interesting. And where you trade one currency against another, to see how much money you can make. And everybody was looking at charts that look sort of like this, and they have various kind of indicators and algorithms on them. And everybody's trying to guess where these currencies are going. It's a difficult problem, and you can see, it's hard to know. And it was very complicated doing this course to find out. And I sort of looked at this and I thought, well, there's another way of looking at this. Because if certain things are true about the way that currencies move, then there's no point in putting all these indicators and things on currencies and trying to guess. And what happened was in the industry was that it was kind of accepted that 50% of your trades worked and 50% didn't. So you had this balance of making and losing money, and you just hoped that the 50% that did work were bigger than the 50% that didn't work. And the very fact that there aren't many traders who actually make a lot of money are testament to the fact that, basically the brokers are gaming it so that they win every time. It's a bit like going into a casino. But what I did was I looked at the environment in which these are working and discovered that the currencies move in fractal patterns that are determined by the Fibonacci sequence and ancient knowledge and Fibonacci ratios. And so I developed this thing which I call the absolute Fibonacci framework, because the currencies absolutely move to this, and you can predict where they're going to go. You can see on this little chart, I did this a week or two ago. I was looking at a currency pair, and you can see that they're actually sticking to very definite lines on my framework. And I knew at the time, and I stuck this arrow in on this screenshot, I knew that those currencies were going to go exactly to that line, which is what they did. So, and then after that, they went back again. So if you had got into a trade where I started and got out of a trade at the top, you'd be fine. But if you got into that trade and got to that line and thought it was going to carry on up, you'd have been stuffed because it went down again and you'd have lost money. So, that's an example of just not looking at the way things are conventionally seen, but really looking at a completely different way of assessing the entire environment. And that, it works to this day. As I say, I did that a couple of weeks ago. I invented it in 2005. And it's completely consistent. What is interesting about this one, though, is that I was so successful that the brokers started blocking me. I had friends who'd actually, there was one guy bought a house on the strength of this. They basically sort of manipulate the trade so that you can't get in early enough, or or they basically just simply stop you. So their game is like a casino, So if you keep winning, they find ways to stop you. Anyway, so after that, I found that I wanted to look at thinking in a different way. So I just went into art, which is, for me, it was the biggest challenge of all, because you're working from nothing every time. And the way I work is with what I call a beginner's mind. It's not learning a technique. It's basically taking a white canvas and building something new every single time. It's not easy, but that's the way my brain works. So, and that was, I found, was much more satisfying, at the same time incredibly challenging, because everything else has rules attached to it, and everything else you can make judgments about. The biggest judgment here is myself, but also, you can't sell art either. People have to just buy it because they love it, and I did many different types, and I've had lots of exhibitions and books and things. One of my books is about art and things, and book illustrations. This was my wife's bestseller on relationships, called Fit for Love. And this was fun, talking about relationships and love and things like this. And I did do lots of cartoons, and some of them become, quite political. This is our friends Nestle, and some of them are just for the hell of it, like social sharing. But this. They say that innovators in business tend to work like artists. They think like artists. They operate like artists. So I thought, well, let's be an artist. And that has fed the business more than anything else that I've ever done before. So ultimately, what we're looking for is how to get back to ourselves. And that's what I feel I've been doing. It's an ongoing dynamic journey. But there are various things that you can do to help yourself get back to this state. One is follow your gut. Don't do what people think you should do. Do it even if it's uncomfortable, and no one thinks you should. That's that. If you feel it, just do it. Don't do things that make sense, because sense is often a collective agreement, sometimes based on nothing worthwhile. And you shouldn't let facts divert your instincts. And so next thing, question everything. Absolutely everything. If I hadn't questioned everything, I would never have figured out that trading thing. I would never have figured out that cell phones, the problems with cell phone and so on. So by questioning things, you're basically just not accepting them just because people say that's the way things are. Because you can question everything and ask, does this serve me or does it serve the world in the best way? Remember, creativity means also that you're on your own, in your own power. And that may not be in alignment with others, and certainly not in alignment with the majority. But when you question everything, you set something moving very often. And the next thing is to trust, jump in, get comfortable with change and ambiguity. Because, there were many times in my life where the changes that were happening, or the changes that were happening in me were very uncomfortable, because one of the reasons, of course, is like in relationships. If you change and your partner doesn't, then you actually create friction or a difficulty there. And it may be time to move on, or maybe the other person can accept that, and you can actually have a wonderful, diverse relationship that works in better ways. But you have to be comfortable with that change and ambiguity and own it. You have to make time for creativity, because we're all busy. It's very easy to simply say, I just don't have time, and it's much more comfortable just to stick with a process that because creativity is by its very nature uncomfortable. And you have to make time for creativity. No, that's not a typo. That is, within that time that you created for your creativity, you have to give yourself time. Because what I find, and this is typically when I'm doing either brand work or whatever for people, you're trying to dream up something like a logo or something like this. The first ideas are absolute rubbish. They're cliched. They're basically stimulated by stuff you've seen before very often. And so they're not creative in a sense, and they're not really worthwhile. The next thing is learn to learn. There is research that shows that if you Google everything, it kills brain cells, unless it's used consciously. So learning to learn is something we're starting to avoid now, particularly with AI. If we want to know something, do a little prompt, and there you've got it, So you haven't necessarily learned it, but you've got an answer. So very different. If you're doing it consciously, that's one thing. If you're doing it unconsciously, it's not necessarily going to work. And the last thing is, don't get stuck. Life moves on. You saw a lot of my projects that you could probably say, oh, they were failures, but they weren't. They actually had impacts. They did things, and certainly I enjoyed them. But the reality of life changed with each and every single one of them, and so I got off the S curve at the right time before I found that it was actually making me go broke. Started other things, and that's a good example of how that happens. And you have to be prepared to let go and stay open and alert to new ideas. So you don't hang on to ideas beyond their sell-by date, and be aware enough to know when that's going to happen. And lastly, it is about play. You remember the compass? It's stay on that left side. It's about engagement. It's not about results. The right time to do this doesn't exist. The opportunities come when you start creating and putting yourself out there, not when everything feels perfect. That will never happen. And if it's truly creative, there are no neat, convenient answers. You have to get involved and work through to clarity. You have to get through the uncertainty. You have to get through the confusion of an idea that comes up that you don't know how to apply. You don't know if it's real or if it's valid or anything. You have to work through it. And it's about discovery. It's not about confirmation, strangely. That's why I work with a beginner's mind, because I don't want to say, oh, I know how to do a painting, or I know how to create a logo. I know what this company needs. It's not about that. Look, most people, successful people, they don't follow a plan, or they don't start with a plan at least. They follow their curiosity. It's all about curiosity and discovery. So it could be some side project, a random opportunity or something that makes no sense, but just sort of triggers something in you, because plans give you comfort. Curiosity gives you breakthroughs. So stop planning and start exploring is what I'd say. And success in creativity is built in the quiet, unglamorous moments, the late nights, the failed experiments, the work no one ever sees very often, the sort of scribbles in a book. That's where your voice is forged. It's not in the glamour, and you have to just keep going like no one's watching. So I'm hoping some of these truths are truths for you as well. But ultimately, for me, none of it's worth anything without self-awareness, self-knowledge, a higher consciousness, and love. Unless you engage those first, you're actually wasting your time. Because I've seen how people, whether intelligent, ignorant, arrogant, intellectual, humble, allow themselves to be led like lemmings to the cliff edge and to switch off their rational minds, as we saw in COVID and things, to ignore and deny dangers to themselves and the planet, to embrace and subscribe enthusiastically to dysfunction, and you can see a lot of that in AI, and compromise everything through fear because they feel they've got to keep up and so on and so forth. And this pattern continues, and it's accelerating at an alarming rate. It's best to seek out your own marvelous, unique creativity now. It's more urgent than you may think. And given what I've said, will any of this make any difference in your life? That's not a rhetorical question. Will it change anything? Think about that. Do you actually want meaningful change? I know, of course, that this presentation may just be interesting, an interesting, perhaps reflective diversion to be forgotten at the next distraction. But while this is my gift to you, I do this for me, to remind me that it's only through creativity that I will survive and thrive during the time that I'm here. And with that, let's roll the credits.
Hi, Luis. It was very good to hear your presentation. I think there are some very interesting points.
Thank you.
One question, which obviously will tell you a little bit about my background. How much of creativity you think is real creativity, and how much of it is just exploring all the possible combinations of things?
Well, that's an interesting one because I mean, in a sense, creativity is about juxtaposing different ideas, different thoughts. As you saw, I mean, there were lots of things where you just look at things differently, or you connect two different things. So whether it's ultimately absolutely creative, I mean, I can't possibly say, and whether that matters or not, I don't know. But for instance, when I designed the absolute Fibonacci framework, I felt that was ultimately creative. But of course, I was actually basing the whole thing on something that people have known for centuries. But the use of that in that sense was completely unique. So I guess that's what I feel about that. I don't know. And in a sense, I don't think it matters. You know.
Because one of the things that, one of the challenge you could say I think many people have is that we've been trained in a very scientific way of thinking.
Yes.
Which means, for example, you have to troubleshoot an issue with a scientific instrument, you go through a procedure, or you've got a financial problem, you go through a procedure. But obviously there is a cost benefit problem with that because you cannot go through all the combinations all the time.
No.
So how you get to develop your actual creativity, which means perhaps finding the best path rather than going through iterations. How do you do that?
Look, you've got to find your own way. It's going to be different for everybody. What I tried to do with this presentation was show diversity. I don't think I've approached any of those things in the same way each time. There's no formula, So I think, when you're really, it's to do, as I say, with knowing yourself, with having a kind of consciousness and awareness that actually generates those moments that you take trouble to take notice of. It's a bit like, when you wake up in the morning. I mean, when I wake up in the morning, I often come out of a dream or something, and something's there, And I tell you, Hominin, my novel, that's how that happened. And I normally I forget my dreams, but that's stayed. And my wife said, "Well, why don't you write it?" I said, "I'm not a writer," So, but anyway, what we ended, I tell you a funny story around that actually was that we were living in Ireland at the time and renting a house, and I said, "Well, I haven't got time. I need space to do this." So I went and asked our landlord for a rent holiday of a month. And he said, "Yeah, sure." I don't know how many landlords would do that. And what we did was we went and rented a beautiful 4-story house on the beach in Portugal. And for a month, and I just wrote every single day. I set myself a target to write every single day. I didn't know what I was going to write. And that was cheaper than living back in Ireland, Anyway, so it's different every time, and that's the beauty of it as well. If it's not different every time, you're just going through a process,
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's a very good insight. Very good insight. Thank you.
And thank you for your question. Alfredo.
Yes. Well, congratulations. I enjoyed it a lot. And for me, it was kind of going back and a wake-up call. I worked for 3 companies, 3 multinationals, that each one has got more than 100 years.
Yeah.
L'Oreal, Nabisco, and Henkel. They've lasted that long because of creativity. So how to balance that? Otherwise, I work in categories where you need to be launching 2, 3, 4 times on a yearly basis new products. Otherwise, you will not survive. So for me, it got me to remember that it's all about self-consciousness. Otherwise, you get stuck and you get trapped on a daily basis in the routine. So it was beautiful. I mean, in that sense, we need to force ourselves to be creative, to question everything. If it ain't broken, fix it in that way.
But also, you know, you need to relax into it as well.
Yes.
Because you know, you can't be creative under pressure. And the company culture is very, very important in that sense, in allowing people to have that space and time to make mistakes as well. I mean, 90% of your creative thinking will come out as some sort of mistake, or you know, it won't go anywhere necessarily. But you've got to have that freedom to do that, you know.
Yes, and also have the courage.
Yes, absolutely.
To take the plunge.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, you know, Stephen Bartlett at the moment has actually employed people to basically destroy his company. to destroy the model that he built that's made him successful, because he wants to make sure that he's moving on, that he's not getting stuck.
Well, that was great.
And that's brave. You know, it's brave, but it also makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
If you think about it. Hanan, hello. Lovely to see you.
Hello. Thank you, Lois, for your presentation. I loved it too, especially the last bit. I wanted to say the same that Alfredo said, that creativity is also about being about bravery. And we always used to hear from people like artists that creativity doesn't make money and all of these things, but it's the other way around. I also wanted to say that you can be creative, successful, and you can maintain your integrity with your values.
Absolutely.
What I felt. Yeah, so yeah.
Well, I think, you know, if you're out of integrity when you're not being creative, in a sense, you could say, because if, you know, none of us are built to just put ourselves through a process for all our lives, and we're inherently creative. So, you know, if you haven't got that space to be creative, you're actually compromising yourself. So you could look at it like that, I guess. Safar.
Thank you, Louis, for today's presentation. I have two questions. Can we all the time be creative? And the second question is, what's the healthy ratio between creating and consuming, especially in the age of digital content where we're bombarded by videos, posts, LinkedIn, Facebook content all the time?
Yeah. I think, again, going back to what Gabriel was saying, it's an individual choice. You can't set rules around this, but we do live, as you say, in a completely overwhelming situation now, and I find it more and more important to disconnect from that, because the creativity doesn't happen when you're consuming stuff on the screen all the time, all day and all night. I find fitness very important. You know, I go for long bike rides, you know, completely unnecessary bike rides that basically clear my head of all this stuff. I also am very fortunate, as I've mentioned before, in having a partner who is very clear about this, you know, and reminds me not when, because there's a kind of, I guess, a kind of tension and stress that builds up when you're always consumed by this digital world, and a kind of deadening that happens with routine. I should admit, I even found that yesterday in the meeting, you know, that going through the same routine, I found it just left me cold. I didn't even want to hear what people were saying because I knew what they were going to say. So, you know, it felt like we were sort of wasting precious time in a way. I felt I often feel like that if I'm, I mean, I'm particularly bad at this, you know. I mean, if I do something for more than 2 or 3 years, I'm completely bored out of my brain, which is why I'm not rich, probably. But you know, I could be, and I'll probably go back to the currency trading to make a bit of money. But yeah, I mean, we have to make use of the time, and it's about being conscious, not deciding how much time. You know, that's very left brain. And I think it's just about being conscious and hearing those little hints and watching out for those little signs that tell you that something else is going on here, and really allowing yourself to act on them. You know, that's for me is what it is. Yeah. Same with the painting. That's interesting because I start a painting, I haven't the faintest idea where it's going to go. But along the way, you know, the marks that are generated create other marks that, you know, stimulate other movements and things. And maybe, you know, I go and eat something and that changes the mood or whatever, you know. I mean, but it's being sensitive to all those things that, you know, new things build, I think. Yeah, sorry. Jose, hello.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I really enjoyed the presentation. Good. And as I think it's very valuable as someone that works in the audiovisual medium, and I have a lot of like artist friends. I think that's something, this idea of always exploring is something that it's even sometimes lost in even the arts. I think you can get very complacent on figuring out like a technique, a style, then trying to replicate it. So I think it was very interesting to see it from that approach, and sort of even comparing it to a lot of people that surround me in that medium, sort of seeing like, yeah, you sort of do get complacent. And I do think it's important to break out of that mold and truly sort of challenge yourself into exploring and not searching for a final result.
Absolutely. Yeah. I can really relate to that. Thank you. Because I mean, you know, if you look at sort of, you know, Facebook reels and things where artists are showing you how you do something, you know, it's so ridiculous. Or people go on courses to try and find out how to write a song or whatever. I don't know. I mean, you know, coaches, everybody, they're looking for other people's information to incorporate into their lives verbatim. And it doesn't serve them, because basically you commoditize yourself in that way. You just become another one. So, you know, and we always see how, you know, then price is the only factor or something. You know, it just basically kills it. It doesn't actually improve you necessarily to go on a course. It's more about being self-aware. Because if you think about it, the only artists and singers and people we remember are those that are doing stuff that is highly individual, very interesting. You know, you think of people like Bob Dylan, David Bowie, you know, they didn't go on a course and say, oh, how do I write a song about this? You know, they worked from their hearts, and that's the only way to work for me. Yeah.
Lovely. Thanks.
You're very welcome. And I think we're coming up to 7 o'clock, aren't we? So I don't know if you want to close this off, Safar, or what?
Oh, well, I had another question, but I think...
Oh, sure, yeah.
Well, it's just to build on what you just said now. Like, some of us may go on courses because we can't always reinvent the wheel, or we want to build on other people's experience. and take advantage of the collective intelligence.
Mhm.
So would that be wrong? Since we
Well,
can
there's no
build on
right and wrong.
that to create in our own
Mhm.
way whatever
Yeah.
we want to create.
Yeah, there's no right and wrong, obviously, because to go on a course to build on something, you're building on what your own thing is, so you're improving it. But the business model's the same. You're just basically going up that curve, aren't you? Up the S curve. You're basically making sure that you stay relevant and that you're offering better, you're more competitive or whatever, but it's all about how you're using these tools. It's like the big debate about AI is it going to take us over, or are we going to use it as a tool? And being creative isn't about necessarily even thinking up something totally new. It's about creating new connections. It's about seeing things in a different way, or incorporating something into what you're offering in a unique way. Or if it's the same as someone else, you just have to accept that it's you're basically putting yourself into that same mold, and sometimes that works. So I'm not saying you should never do what everybody else does, but at the same time, you're only going to really make a mark if you do what you do. Which is why I asked Zioni the other day, is she trying to find her own voice, or is she trying to find ways to market herself that will become acceptable, in other people's eyes? And that's a very different way of approaching it, and a very dangerous way, because as soon as you do that, you're basically working backwards. You're not actually offering something wonderful. You're basically hoping that someone's going to pick up because they've seen it before, and you're going to be as good as that. So that's all I'm going to say, I think.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much, Louis, for the presentation. Very thought-provoking.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Hanan. Thank you, Jose, Gabriel.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.
For
Yeah.
staying till the end.
Yes.
Pleasure. Hopefully see you very soon next Wednesday, same time, with our networking sessions. Thank you again, Louis.
You're very welcome. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.